So our first section is identity management, so making sure the correct users and groups are available to the system and that it works. So we'll look at configuring VIA to return those correct users and groups. We'll look at how we provide credentials for access to third-party software like databases. We'll look at the level of access to functionality that's provided by the default users and groups within VIA, and how to modify custom group membership to administer access to VIA functionality. So just a little word on terminology. Authentication and authorization, they both start with auth, right? People get them confused. Authentication is the verification of identity for initial access. So that's checking who you are. And authorization is what you can do once you have that initial access, once you're within a system. Basically in class we're going to be talking about authorization. Authentication's covered in the other class, in the architecture class. So you can think of this as, if you're coming into SAS and if we were a bit more strict and the guy at the front desk, the guy at the gate didn't just wave at you, he actually checked your ID. So if he checked your ID, he sees you're a SAS employee, you're allowed to come in, right? And then once you're within SAS, so that's authentication. Once you're in SAS, your authorization is going to determine where you can go within the campus, what buildings you can get into. Okay? So we already been mentioned that the visual interfaces support a variety of ways to authenticate. But doesn't matter what way you have authentication set up, within VIA you have to have an LDAP server for identity management. So we're required to have an LDAP server. The way it works is, on our diagram, we have our LDAP server on the left with our users and groups. We set up a read-only connection to LDAP. The users and groups returned to the environment are returned based on that configuration. So based on the connection information you give it and the parameters you set, that's going to determine what users and groups are returned from LDAP to VIA. When they are returned, they're stored in a VIA identity cache. So when we go to authenticate, it's going to go to the identity cache, not to LDAP. The identity cache is refreshed every 12 hours. So every 12 hours, a connection will be made to LDAP, and based on the parameters that you've filled in, we'll refresh the identity cache with the users and groups that should be within the VIA environment. That is for users and groups. So we don't have any users stored within VIA. They all come from LDAP. Groups come from LDAP too, based on the configuration, but we also have a construct within VIA, custom groups. So you can create your own custom groups within VIA that don't exist in LDAP. Okay? First section, we're going to look at configuring access to LDAP, so determining what users and groups will return. So some of the things, question? Yeah.
Sorry, quick question. You were talking about the custom groups. Is there a possibility of a conflict if you gave the same name to a custom group that existed as a group in LDAP already?
So the question is could there be a conflict if you give the same name to a custom group as an LDAP group? Yeah, there probably could be. There's actually a group ID and a group name. So I think the conflict would be if you try to use the same ID in both places. But yes, you'd have to, I think if you did that, it wouldn't let you do it, whichever one you were doing first. So to integrate with LDAP, you obviously need to know the connection information for the LDAP server. So that would be a user ID that can connect to LDAP and get that read-only access, password for that user ID, the host that the LDAP server is running on, and the port that the LDAP server is running on. So that's your initial connection information. And then what you do is you map the attributes from LDAP to the attributes that VIA is expecting. So you'll be mapping the user ID in LDAP to the user ID field in VIA, the name in LDAP to the name in VIA, the description in LDAP to the description in VIA, maybe the department, so that you can map all these LDAP attributes to the attributes within VIA. And then the next thing you need is a base DN, where you want to start your search for the users and groups to return. So when it makes a connection, it's going to want to look for users and want to look for groups, and the base DN tells it where in the LDAP tree to start its search. So for us, our base DN for groups is going to be OU equals groups, DC equals gelrace, DC equals .com. meaning start to look for the groups I want to return at that place in the tree, go down the tree from there. And then the same thing for users. And then in addition to where you want to start your search, you pass it an LDAP query to filter the users and groups that are returned. So start my search here and then return users and groups that have these particular attributes that satisfy this query that I'm going to pass in. And that integration can be done during deployment. Rob mentioned the site default YAML file. You can enter your LDAP information in that and it will set up LDAP during your deployment. If you get everything correct, you'll be able to log on initially as an LDAP user. And it can also happen post-deployment in SaaS Environment Manager. So you can log into SaaS Environment Manager. And to do that, you would use the SaaS boot account, which is kind of like an internal account, an initial account you get. It's the initial administrator on the system. To access it, as was mentioned earlier, you grep for the term SaaS boot in the log of the SaaS logon server. It returns you, the bottom here is the command, the output of the command of grepping for SaaS boot. It's going to return you part of a URL. You paste that URL into your browser, and when you do that, what you're going to get surfaced is a logon for SaaS Environment Manager telling you your password's expired. You enter the password twice and you're logged on, and that's you set the password for the SaaS boot account. You can now use the SaaS boot account to configure your access to LDAP. Typically, that's why you would use the SaaS boot account. Initially, when you can't log on to the system and LDAP's not set up, we need this user to be able to log on and set up a connection to LDAP, right? It's also can be useful in other cases though. If you have any kind of problem with authentication, getting onto the system, the SaaS boot account can be an account that you can go back to, and it can usually log on in most cases when maybe another account can't, and you can use it to troubleshoot and to fix your problem. So it's available even after you use it initially for any kind of troubleshooting or fixing at a later time. So LDAP queries, some of the initial VIA installations didn't do a good job of subsetting the users and groups returned, and if you don't do that, you can really run out of resources. So it's a best practice to narrow down the users and groups that are returned to LDAP, or else you can run out of memory. Another reason to do that, to enter an LDAP query, would be sometimes in LDAP we have things stored that are not people. You get things like printers in LDAP, you get things like mailing lists in LDAP, other things within LDAP. You want to be able to filter out those things. You want to be able to filter out any users that have left your organization. So it really is a best practice to get your query correct so that you're only returning to VIA the users and the groups that you're interested in, that you want, for performance reasons and for those operational reasons. Identities is controlled by the identity service. So that's the microservice behind the scenes that's doing all this operations around users and groups and connecting to LDAP. And then the configuration for that microservice stored in the SaaS configuration server, there is SaaS Identities Provider's LDAP connection. That's where you enter the connection information to the LDAP server. Then there's an LDAP user set of configuration properties and an LDAP group set of configuration properties. You edit the user one to say what user information you want returned, and the group one to say what groups you want returned. And then the filter, the parameter for the filter is the object filter parameter. The default, the first one is the user one, and the default is just to return all objects from LDAP which have that object class, inet.org person. So that's basically people objects from LDAP, just give me everything. So you're probably always going to be wanting to edit that and to add some other qualifying parameters to that, which we will do in the exercise. And the group one just says similarly, give me every object from LDAP that has an object class of group of names. So give me all groups from LDAP. LDAP queries are a little different. The syntax is not the same as SQL or where clauses within SAS. It's slightly different, but you can navigate it fairly easily. There's a link in the notes of the materials there that's going to give you some information about how to build LDAP queries. Got a few examples on the screen. The first one just says I want objects return where the region equals east, so people in the east region that don't have a blank employee ID. So the and is outside the brackets, which to me is a little strange, but that's the way it works. And then the second one saying I want all group of names objects, but where the name is not equal to SAS LDAP. So give me all group of names objects, but the one that's equal to SAS LDAP, where it's name. And then the last one is saying give me all people who are a member of the Orion Star organization. So some example queries. I mentioned the cache. The first question that usually comes to mind when you say there's a cache is, how do you refresh the cache? Can you change the cache interval? The cache interval can be adjusted. The default is 12 hours. So that means that the identity service every 12 hours is going to go to LDAP and refresh your users and groups. You can shorten it if you need to. It's recommended really to keep it at 12 hours for performance reasons, but you can narrow it down if you want to. You can refresh the cache to retrieve new users and groups. For the first time in 3.4 was added the ability to refresh it from the CLI. So that's quite useful. SAS admin identities refresh cache is going to refresh your cache on demand. There's no way to do it from the interface. So there's no button in Environment Manager that says refresh my cache. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a default for the cache if we do it from the interface if you don't run this? If you add another user?
If you add a user, you have to run this or you're waiting for 12 hours and you don't really know when your 12 hours is going to expire. Yeah, just depends when it was last refreshed, right? Could be you'll be lucky and it's 5 minutes from now. Could be you'll be unlucky and it's 11 hours and 55 minutes from now, right? If you restart the identity service, the cache is refreshed also. So you can do a bounce of the identity service. That's another way to do it. Now that we have the CLI version, it's probably best to use the CLI. If you make a change within Environment Manager to any of the properties, it does refresh the cache also. So if I were to go in and change one of the mappings of the configuration for identities in Environment Manager, it will be refreshed within about a 3 to 5 minute period. But if you make a change in LDAP, it doesn't work that way. Any changes in LDAP, it doesn't know about. There is a new logger was added in 3.3. As was mentioned this morning, it can be a time-consuming and error-prone task to set up your connection to LDAP. A logger was added in 3.3 to com.sas identities. If you set that logger to trace, then in the log of the identity service, you get the query that's been executed by LDAP to retrieve the users and groups and the result of the query. So if you have any problems and a symptom would be you can't log on, or maybe you go to the groups within SAS Environment Manager, you can't see any members of the groups or something like that, the best thing to do is to turn that trace login on. You don't have to restart any services. It's going to pick that up automatically. And then you can go look at that log. You can see maybe something wrong with your query. It's not returning the right things. It's got some kind of typo in it or something like that. It was a big help in addressing some of the issues if you run into problems. All right, the next hands-on is GelVia 3.4 ADM initial admin 06 initial admin 01. So you're moving into another MHT file, which you'll be using for the rest of the day and into tomorrow. And what we're going to do is, currently the finance users are in our environment. We said that we didn't want finance in there, so you're going to modify the LDAP configuration so that we only get the HR and the sales users in the environment. Okay, the next section we're going to look at access to credentials for databases. So we have this concept in VIA called domains. Domains are used to store credentials required to access external data sources, so things like databases. And it maps the credential to the identities that are allowed to use those credentials. So we're not talking about the credentials you use to log on to VIA, the things that's coming from LDAP that we just did. We're talking about something that VIA is going to use to log on to a third-party resource, like a database or Hadoop or something like that. There are 3 types of domains. Authentication domains, that's the one we're going to talk about in this section, which you can use to access an external resource like a database that's associated with a CAS lib. Connection domains is another type of domain that's used when you need to store a user ID but no password. So if the connection needs to be set up without a password, you can use a connection domain. And an encryption domain stores an encryption key required to read data assigned to a CAS lib. So data at rest in a path-based CAS lib. But we're only going to talk about authentication in this section, authentication domains. Basically, it's pretty simple. An authentication domain makes a set of credentials available to a set of users or groups, usually groups, right? You try to assign it to groups, it's easier to maintain, so that VIA can seamlessly access a resource. So think of an Oracle, or in our case, a Postgres database that has its own authentication system, its own authorization. We don't want, when someone hits the data for that, when they're building a report or accessing a report, we don't want them to be prompted for a logon. So the domain's a way to look up that logon for the user from the software and then pass it to the database. Within SAS Environment Manager, it's in the security area under domains. There's a domain view which lists all the domains that you have defined. There's some default ones that are available automatically, and you can add your own. And then if you click on credentials on a domain, you will see the credentials that are stored for that domain and the user or group that are allocated to those credentials. To be able to see that, by default out of the box, you have to be a member of the SAS Administrators Group. So only administrators can manage domains. To use the domain in SAS Environment Manager, when you set up a CAS lib, there's going to be a place where you can choose a domain. So you can select the domain, saying use this domain with this CAS lib. And then within code, in this case it's procCAS, we're doing a table.add CAS lib action and specifying the connection information to the data source. And within that, you use the authentication domain option to pass it the authentication domain, and it will look up the domain. So how does that work? I kind of already described it. So you log on to SAS VIA as yourself. It looks up your identity and establishes your group memberships, right? So it knows what groups you're a membership, it knows who you are. If you go to access a CAS lib for a database, using your identity information that it's established and the authentication domain for the CAS lib, it's going to look up the credentials. When it looks up the credentials, 2 things can happen. First of all, it finds the credentials. If it finds the credentials, it's going to pass them onto the database. You're still not guaranteed access because maybe the database has got security preventing you from accessing it, but at that point it's up to the database to decide. So I found credentials, I passed it on. Usually you'll get access, but the database's authentication provider will determine that. If it looks up credentials for you and it doesn't find a match in any domains, then you're not going to get access to it. You're going to get a failure saying it can't find credentials to access a database. So fairly simple. Well, very similar to domains in SAS 9.4 if you were used to looking at domains in SAS 9.4. And then the other thing, administrative thing you can do with domains is each user has access to the My Password area where they can manage their own credentials. So that's the credentials for outbound access to things like Postgres or Oracle or DB2. And an individual user can go in and change their own password. But they can't add any credentials, they can't add themselves to groups or anything like that. All they can do is change the passwords for the credentials that they've been allocated. And that's basically provided because a lot of customers don't want administrators knowing other people's passwords. That's a security hole. So that gives the ability for an ordinary user to go in and change their password if it's been changed. but only for outbound access. All right, default groups and access to resources. So we said that we get our users and groups from LDAP, but we also get this thing called custom groups. They're defined within VIA, but not in the identity provider, not within LDAP. So they just exist within VIA. We get a set of default custom groups available. They vary depending on the software that you have licensed. You're typically always going to see SaaS administrators, but depending on whether you've got Model Manager or if you've got some of the data management products, it's going to vary the list of custom groups that are available to you. As well as getting those default custom groups, we can create new custom groups. So that's something that's provided to you so that for your convenience, if your LDAP administrator doesn't like you and refuses to take your calls and won't add any groups to LDAP for you, which can happen, right? I mean, a lot of companies, being serious, a lot of companies are not going to just create groups because a SaaS guy wants a group created. So the custom groups are provided to you so that you have that fallback where you can create custom groups within VIA, and maybe it's for a very specific SaaS purpose. It doesn't make sense to have it created in LDAP. One of the custom groups, and one of the important ones for us, because we're talking about administration, is the SaaS Administrators Custom Group. So the members of the SaaS Administrators Custom Group are administrators on the VIA environment for general administration and authorization. So in this case, I've got an administrators group. I've added Ahmed and Amanda. They, by a default set of rules that are created in the system, are administrators on the VIA environment. So it's similar to being unrestricted administrator or an administrator in SaaS 9.4, but it's a little different. It's allocated by a set of rules being available to you. So a SaaS administrator has a set of rules that gives them access to the system, right? But an unrestricted user, remember how an unrestricted user was in SaaS 9.4? The rules, things didn't apply to them, they were unrestricted. So it's a little bit different. You could change administrator privileges by altering those rules in VIA, whereas in SaaS 9.4 an unrestricted administrator just had unrestricted access. So to complicate things in the VIA and CAS world, CAS has its own sort of grouping of users for CAS administration. There's a CAS administrator role, and the CAS administrator role governs administrative access for CAS lib administration, so data administration and authorization. So we have that within CAS, and then we have administrators within VIA. Sometimes you'll hear the CAS administrator called the super user too. Those two terms are kind of used interchangeably. So what's the relationship? We have CAS administration roles and we have SaaS administrators. Well, by default, when the software is set up, the SaaS administration group is added, the SaaS administrators group is added to the CAS administration role. Meaning if you're a SaaS administrator, you're a CAS administrator by default. That's the relationship between them. You're going to get very familiar with this prompt. I think you've been environment manager already. The SaaS administrators group is an assumable group. What that means is you have to opt into it to get the privileges allocated to that group. So when you're logging into SaaS Environment Manager for the next day and a half, you're going to type in your user ID and password. I think we use SaaS ADM most of the time. And you're always going to see this prompt because it's an assumable group. Do you want to opt into all your assumable groups? And then there's only one, SaaS Administrators is listed. If you click yes, you go in as a SaaS administrator to the system and you're an administrator. If you click no, then you go in, you're still the same user, but you go in without administrative privileges. So it's kind of different from SaaS 9.4 as well. So an administrator can behave like a normal user in VIA by selecting no at that prompt. And then even if I've logged in as a SaaS administrator, I'm still not a CAS administrator or a super user. To get the full privileges of being a SaaS administrator and an administrator on CAS, you have to go to the CAS server. In the servers area, you right-click on it, and you select Assume the Super User role. And when you do that, you can do CAS administration and VIA administration. All right, custom groups. One of the ways we can administer access to functionality within VIA, so that's what applications are available or what people can do within applications, is modify custom groups. So we'll look at that, how to administer access to functionality. So access to functionalities is administered using rules. Rules determine what features are available to a user, such as the applications a user can use. So can I access Data Studio? Can I access Visual Analytics? Can I access SaaS Environment Manager? That's determined by rules. Rules can also get down to a more detailed level. They can govern what menu choices are available within an application. So do I get the modeling functionality within Visual Analytics, or do I just get the basic functionality? What does it sound like? You guys all familiar with SAS 9.4, right? What did we have in SAS 9.4 that did that? Yeah, roles and capabilities, right? So this is the roles and capabilities. But it's rules and custom groups is the way you do it in VIA. So rules target a resource, and the resources are identified within VIA by a uniform resource identifier. So we kind of get two groupings of uniform resource identifiers. The first one is a content URI. The content URI is something like a folder. That's the example on the screen, or a report, or a data plan, or a file, or something like that. Content URIs, the format is microservice. This is the folder's microservice. Endpoint within the microservice. Just happens to be folders here too, so it's folders twice, but it could be something different. And then usually a unique ID identifying that a folder. So that folder might be /gel content /HR, but it's also identified by this unique identifier, the URI and the ID. So that's content URIs. And then we have functionality URIs. So the example on the screen of a functionality URI is SAS Visual Analytics. And then we have the ****. So that identifies the Visual Analytics application, and the two asterisks mean all the functionality that's included in that application. So a double asterisk means the application and everything that's part of the application. A single asterisk means the application and one level of functionality down. I've never really seen the single asterisk being used too much. It's usually always a double asterisk. So Visual Analytics and everything within it. So that rules can target a service endpoint, or there's something called a pseudo URI. So let me explain them. The first one we just looked at. We looked at it for Visual Analytics, but this is for SAS Environment Manager. So a rule can target SAS Environment Manager /**. If you do a deny on that for a particular user, that user won't be able to see SAS Environment Manager. Okay? It can also be a service endpoint, so that's going one level down. If you do it on SAS Environment Manager and then dashboard, that user wouldn't be able to see the dashboard. The dashboard wouldn't be available. And then there will be other service endpoints down. So a rule can hit a service endpoint. And then we also have these things called pseudo URIs. Pseudo URIs were built, created by R&D for functionality that doesn't really meet a particular endpoint. So it's maybe a collection of endpoints. It can't be aimed at one particular endpoint. And so to satisfy that requirement, they created these pseudo URIs, which are made of groupings of endpoints. They always have underscore capabilities in the name, and then usually some kind of grouping after it. So the pseudo URI, SAS Visual Analytics Capabilities Build Analytic Model, applies to a set of menu choices within Visual Analytics that allow you to build an analytical model. And then there's others like that. So that's usually a set of functionality that couldn't easily be aimed at a service or one particular service endpoint. If you were under the covers, you'd probably find that Build Analytic Model was 5 or 6 different service endpoints grouped together. Might make more sense if we look at an example. So this is an example of a rule within SAS Environment Manager. The rule targets SAS Data Studio and all its descendant functionality. It applies to a group. The group is data builders. The rule type is a grant. And the permissions are add, create, delete, read, update, and remove. Really what that is saying is that if you're not in the data builders group, you're not granted access to the Data Studio application. So only members of the data builders group can access the Data Studio. If you want to change access to Data Studio, you can add someone to the data builders group to give them access to it. If you wanted to give everyone that's authenticated to the system access to Data Studio, you could change the principal to be authenticated users can access Data Studio. Then everyone who logs in could access it. But by default, that's the way it's set up. You have to be a member of the data builders group to access Data Studio. In terms of the default groups, this is the level of functionality they get, the way the rules apply. SAS administrators get wide access on the system, so they're able to do everything on the system. And as I mentioned earlier, that group is also a member of the CAS administration role, the super user role, so they're administrators on the CAS system too, for data. Application administrators, initial membership is none, so that means no one can do these sets of functionalities initially in the system. So application administrators can use the publish tile, manage published things, and access the SAS theme designer. So if you want someone to be able to do that in your application, you have to add them to that group. Same with Data Studio. You have to be added to the data builders group. No one is added by default, so no one can access Data Studio out of the box. So some of the things we'll do in the hands-on is start adding people to those groups so that we have users that can do that functionality within the application. Authenticated users, I mentioned them already, is basically an implicit group, meaning everyone who can log on to the application. So when we set up our access to LDAP, we set it up to return a certain number of users, all those users that can access it. Everyone who can log on to VIA is an authenticated user. Authenticated users get access to Visual Analytics, the dashboard in Environment Manager, the data and content page in Environment Manager. So that's the access for an authenticated user, but nothing else. And then everyone applies only if you have guest access enabled. And that means that basically with everyone, you can access the SAS Report Viewer and SAS Mobile BI. It's principally for guest access. And that would be all authenticated users would have access to Report Viewer and Mobile BI, and non-authenticated users and any anonymous users. So you'll only see everyone on the system if you have guest access enabled. So we can manage access to functionality with those sets of groups by adding users to the groups or taking users away from the groups. At the most basic level, that's the way you govern who can do what within VIA. Add them to a group, take them out of a group. There's some other things we can do. In the Rules Manager, which you'll see, you can edit, update, or add new rules to the application. So you can get quite detailed about what you can do in this area. However, the documentation says that for rules that affect access to functionality, there's only certain modifications are supported. So you can only modify endpoints documented in the VIA administration guide. There's a link in your notes to the VIA administration guide and the section that applies to this. And there's a list of endpoints. And those are the only endpoints you're permitted to modify. Nothing else is supported. So for those of you in tech support, that gives you an out if someone calls you and says, hey, I did this. You're like, well, it's not supported, right? And for those endpoints, there's only certain modifications you can make. You can replace a principal. So an example would be the one I mentioned for data builders. If I replaced the principal with authenticated users, then everyone could access Data Studio. You can update the description, and you can copy that rule to create a new rule and change that rule to replace a principal. But that's the only supported changes you're allowed to make. All right, another hands-on. Basically, in this hands-on, we will start to add people to those groups so that we have broad access to the functionality. We have people who can do various things based on the users and groups we have. And we're going to create a new group which we're going to use to restrict certain users and groups from creating reports. So we want a subset of, we only want a subset of our users to be able to create reports in Visual Analytics. So we're going to create a group and set it up so that only certain users can create reports. And then we'll also create a data administrators group and give that group CAS Lib management privileges. So we want to have a group that is our data administrators that can administer CAS and VIA. Okay? So you're still in the same hands-on document, but on the next exercise. So do 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4 and then stop. Okay, so what we've done so far really is set up our users and groups from LDAP into VIA. So we have our users and groups available, and we've taken advantage of some of the custom groups to give different users and different groups within the application access to different functionality. And also we created a custom group ourselves, right? So that we could restrict access for certain users and groups to creating reports. There is some supplemental slides in this section that we don't go over in class that you can go over in your own time.